The feed broadcasted to 1 trillion beings across the Orion Spur. The Galactic Council sat in their gilded high seats, laughing as the Draxian Armada descended upon a single crippled human cruiser. Humanity was extinct, they said. A footnote in the cosmic archives. They called the ship a floating coffin. But they didn't know the UNS Enduring Freedom wasn't built to survive. It was built to break the universe. And when the hull breached, the cosmos didn't just burn, it shattered. The Grand Assembly of the Galactic Council was a marvel of xenological engineering, suspended in the upper atmosphere of Sirius Prime. Its floors were carved from a single continuous sheet of synthetic diamond, and its walls were open to the swirling violet clouds of the gas giant below. For 10,000 years, it had been the seat of order in the galaxy. Tonight, it was an amphitheater of cruelty. Ambassador Thomas Wright stood in the center of the depression floor, his dark suit tailored but noticeably worn, the fabric fraying at the cuffs. He was 64 years old, his face mapped with the deep lines of a man who had spent the last 5 years watching his species be systematically eradicated. Around him, towering in their anti-gravity pods and elevated thrones, sat the delegates of the council. The tall, crystalline Zareth hummed with a soft, condescending blue light. The reptilian Kalen leaned forward on their forearms, their slit eyes fixed on the holographic projection floating in the center of the room. Earth was gone. It had been turned into a glass marble 2 weeks prior by the Draxian Empire. The Draxians, a militaristic, insectoid race, had demanded Earth's dark matter reserves and the dismantling of the Lockheed Boeing orbital shipyards. When humanity refused, the Draxians didn't negotiate. They swarmed. Thomas had begged the Council for intervention. He had invoked the Treaty of Proxima, the Orion Accords, and basic sentient decency. The Council had deliberated, sipping on their nutrient nectars, and ultimately declared the conflict an internal, localized dispute. Behind closed doors, they whispered the truth. Humanity was expanding too fast, innovating too recklessly. A species that had gone from the Wright brothers to localized Alcubierre warp drives in less than 3 centuries was a variable the Council could not control. Letting the Draxians exterminate them was simply good cosmic bookkeeping. Now, the Council had summoned Thomas not to offer condolences, but to force him to watch the final curtain call. Ambassador Wright resonated the voice of Grand Minister Othal, a Zareth whose translated voice sounded like grinding glass. We project this feed for the sake of the archival record. The Draxian swarm has cornered the last fleeing vessel of your robust species. We thought it only fitting you witness the conclusion of your people's history. In the center of the chamber, the massive hologram flickered, displaying the cold, dead space of Sector 44G, the Oort cloud of a nameless frozen system. Surrounded by a sea of stars, 10,000 Draxian warships hung in the void. They were beautiful in a terrifying way, sleek, obsidian teardrops pulsing with the dark purple energy of singularity engines. They formed a massive spherical net, tightening like a noose. In the dead center of the trap floated a single human ship. It was ugly, brutalist, a massive, blocky rectangle of dark gray armor plating, scarred with plasma burns and missing entire sections of its portside hull. The designation painted on its side in stark white English letters read UNS Goliath. It was not a warship. It was a retrofitted supercarrier, originally designed by a joint Northrop-SpaceX coalition back in 2240 as a deep space colony vessel. Now, it was stripped of its habitation rings, heavily armored, and loaded with the last remnants of the United Nations Space Command's Tactical Division. A ripple of clicking and chittering laughter echoed through the council chamber. "Look at it," a Kalen delegate scoffed, the translation software struggling to capture the sheer arrogance in his tone. Chemical thrusters venting atmosphere, primitive kinetic batteries. Your people, Ambassador Wright, die exactly as they live, stumbling in the dark, throwing rocks at the sky. Thomas didn't look up at them. He kept his eyes fixed on the Goliath. He knew what the council didn't. He knew the files that General Robert Mitchell had handed him in a subterranean bunker beneath the Pentagon, just hours before the Draxian orbital bombardment began. "They are hailing you, Ambassador," Othal said, gesturing with a crystalline appendage. "The Draxian fleet commander wishes you to hear their final surrender demand." The audio feed patched through. The grating, synthetic voice of the Draxian commander filled the diamond hall. "Human vessel, Goliath. Your homeworld is ash. Your colonies are silenced. Your kinetic weapons cannot pierce our quantum shielding. Power down your primitive fusion reactor and prepare for boarding. You will be processed as biological fuel. Refuse, and you will be atomized. Thomas clenched his fists at his sides. He waited for the response. Through the static, the exhausted, distinctly Texan drawl of Captain David Miller echoed into the grand chamber of the Galactic Council. Draxian Fleet, this is Captain Miller of the UNS Goliath. I'm afraid I can't comply with your request. Our reactor's a little temperamental today, but we do have a counteroffer. Tell your commander to go straight to hell. The alien delegates erupted into a cacophony of mocking laughter. Defiant to the last microscopic fraction of a second, Othal sneered. How quaint, how utterly predictably human. They have no shields, Ambassador. They have no hyperlane escape routes. The mathematics are absolute. Thomas finally looked up, his eyes locking with the Grand Minister. A cold, terrifying calm settled over him. You're right, Minister. The mathematics are absolute. But you never bothered to check our math. 3,000 light-years away, the bridge of the UNS Goliath was bathed in the harsh red glare of emergency lighting. The air smelled of burning ozone, sweat, and leaking coolant. Sparks showered from a blown conduit above the navigation console, raining down on the metal deck plates. Captain David Miller stood by the central tactical table, gripping the edges so hard his knuckles were white. The tactical display was a nightmare. A solid wall of red contacts surrounded the solitary blue blip of the Goliath. "Report!" Miller barked, his voice cutting through the blaring klaxons. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Jenkins wiped a streak of soot and blood from her forehead, her fingers flying across the holographic terminal. "Hull integrity is at 40%, sir. We've lost decks 4 through 9. Life support is failing in the lower engineering bays. Sir, the Draxians are charging their plasma lances. We have maybe 3 minutes before they unleash a unified barrage. We can't take even a grazing hit." "What about our offensive batteries?" Miller asked. "Railguns 1 through 4 are offline," Jenkins replied, her voice remarkably steady for a woman who knew she was about to die. "Tungsten rounds from Battery 5 are bouncing off their quantum shields like rain on a tin roof. We're throwing stones at a fortress, Captain." Miller looked at the view screen. The obsidian teardrops of the Draxian Armada were glowing with a sickening violet light, charging the energy weapons that had turned Earth's oceans to steam. In the back of the bridge, huddled over a heavily encrypted standalone console, stood Dr. Harrison Wells. He didn't wear a uniform. He wore a rumpled DARPA civilian lab coat, his face illuminated by streams of complex, scrolling data that looked like pure gibberish to the rest of the military crew. "Dr. Wells," Miller called out, his voice dropping an octave. "Status on Project Gungnir." Wells pushed his glasses up his nose, his hands trembling slightly as he typed. "The containment field is unstable, Captain. We're holding back pressures that shouldn't exist in this dimension. The CERN modifications to the Alcubierre-Penrose manifold are holding, but barely. If I disengage the magnetic locks, the reaction will be, well, it will be irreversible." "That's the point, Doctor," Miller said grimly. "The Goliath wasn't a colony ship anymore, and it certainly wasn't a warship. It was a delivery mechanism. When the Draxian invasion began, the brightest minds at DARPA, CERN, and the remnants of the Raytheon Deep Space Division realized humanity could not win a conventional war. The alien quantum shielding defied all known kinetic and plasma weaponry. So, humanity stopped trying to build a better gun. They decided to weaponize the fundamental laws of reality. Deep in the belly of the Goliath, locked inside a hyperdense lead and titanium vault, sat a dark matter reactor strapped to an inverted Alcubierre warp drive. A warp drive normally bends space to allow a ship to ride a wave of compressed space-time, moving faster than light without violating relativity. Project Gungnir was designed to do the opposite. It was designed to rip the wave apart. "Captain, Draxian energy spikes are reaching critical," Jenkins shouted, snapping Miller back to the present. "Targeting sensors indicate they are locking onto our bridge." "Helm, give me full thrusters," Miller ordered. "Put us dead center of their formation. Make them think we're trying to ram." "Aye, sir. Full burn." The massive ship groaned in protest as its chemical thrusters ignited, pushing the crippled Leviathan forward. The Draxian fleet didn't even bother to move. They simply adjusted their aim, confident in their absolute superiority. To them, the Goliath was a wounded animal charging the firing squad. "Human vessel, The Draxian commander's voice crackled over the open channel one last time. Your futile gesture changes nothing. Firing sequence initiated. Miller looked around the bridge. He looked at Jenkins, at the young navigator Dent, at Dr. Wells. There was no panic left, only a resolute, terrifying acceptance. They were the ghosts of a dead world, and they were about to drag their killers into the dark with them. It's been an honor, people, Miller said softly. He turned to the civilian scientist. Dr. Wells, drop the hammer. Wells took a deep breath, flipped the protective cover off the analog override switch on his console, and slammed his hand down on the glowing red button. Containment locks disengaged. Gungnir is live. May God have mercy on us all. Back in the Galactic Council chamber, Ambassador Thomas Wright watched the hologram with bated breath. The alien delegates were leaning forward, anticipating the brilliant flash of plasma that would finally erase the human pestilence from the galaxy. Grand Minister Othal raised a glass of bioluminescent nectar, a toast to the Draxian efficiency. A swift end, Othal murmured. A mercy, really. On the tactical display, the thousands of Draxian ships unleashed their plasma lances simultaneously. A converging web of blinding violet energy struck the UNS Goliath. But the ship didn't explode. In fact, the plasma beams didn't even touch the hull. A fraction of a second before impact, the space around the Goliath simply stopped. The holographic display in the council chamber glitched, emitting a high-pitched electronic whine. The visual feed warped, the light bending at impossible, sickening angles. "What is happening?" demanded a Kalan delegate, slapping his console. "Is the feed malfunctioning?" "It is not the feed," whispered the Zareth chief technician, his crystalline body vibrating with sudden, undeniable terror. The telemetry. It's impossible. Mass readings in Sector 44G are spiking. It's exceeding solar parameters. It's exceeding galactic parameters." Thomas Wright stepped forward, his voice cutting through the sudden panic in the room like a blade. "We knew we couldn't break their shields. Their shields are designed to deflect physical, matter, and energy. So, we decided not to hit them with matter or energy." On the display, the Goliath began to fold in on itself. Not from damage, but from gravity. The CERN-modified drive had collapsed its warp bubble inward, crushing the ship's dark matter core into an artificial, microscopic singularity. But the DARPA weaponization didn't let the black hole stabilize. It inverted it. Weaponized Hawking radiation mixed with a catastrophic spatial tear. The Goliath vanished, replaced by a sphere of absolute, light-devouring darkness. And then, the universe snapped back. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated gravitational shear exploded outward at the speed of light. It wasn't an explosion of fire, it was a tidal wave of distorted reality. The Council watched in absolute, stunned silence as the shockwave hit the first ring of Draxian warships. The quantum shields of the alien vessels, the impenetrable armor that had tanked Earth's nuclear arsenal without a scratch, were entirely useless. You cannot shield against the geometry of space itself being rewritten. The Draxian ships didn't shatter, they stretched. Under the horrific power of the gravitational wave, the obsidian teardrops were instantly spaghettified. Titanium alloy hulls, hyper-advanced plasma engines, and insectoid crews were violently drawn out into miles-long threads of glowing atoms, screaming silently into the void. The wave expanded, an unstoppable ripple in the pond of space-time. In less than 3 seconds, the entire Draxian Armada, 10,000 invincible warships, the pride of the insectoid empire, the fleet that had burned Earth to the ground, was simply erased, eradicated from physical existence, turned into an expanding cloud of subatomic dust, glowing with the eerie blue light of Cherenkov radiation. Where a massive, terrifying armada had hung just moments before, there was now only empty space, swirling with the violent, unnatural currents of a shattered dimension. The grand diamond hall of the Galactic Council was so quiet you could hear the hum of the atmospheric regulators. The holographic display flickered, rendering the massive expanse of nothingness. The Draxian blips were gone. The Goliath was gone. Sector 44G was a graveyard of broken physics. The nectar glass slipped from Grand Minister Othal's appendage, shattering into 1,000 pieces against the diamond floor. The sound made several delegates flinch. Ambassador Thomas Wright adjusted his fraying cuffs, straightening his posture. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by the cold, hard steel of a predator that had just bared its teeth. "You called us primitive," Thomas said, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Every alien eye in the chamber was locked onto him, wide with an emotion they hadn't felt in millennia. Dread. "You sat in your high chairs and mocked us for throwing rocks. You let Earth burn because you thought we were a transient pest." Thomas took a slow, deliberate step toward the Grand Minister's podium. "We don't have ships anymore. We don't have a homeworld. But my people left behind 50 more deep space carriers just like the Goliath, scattered and hidden in the dark corners of this galaxy. All of them equipped with Project Gungnir. All of them carrying dead men and women who have absolutely nothing left to lose." Thomas stared directly into the multifaceted eyes of the alien leader. "We are humanity, and if we can't live in this universe, we will take it with us." The silence in the Galactic Council chamber was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The air, usually circulating with the synthesized sense of 100 different alien flora, suddenly felt thin. For 10,000 years, this room had dictated the fate of trillions. It had ordered the sterilization of entire sectors, the uplifting of primitive species, and the subjugation of empires. Yet, in the span of 3 seconds, the ultimate authority in the Orion Spur had been paralyzed by a species that officially no longer existed. Grand Minister Othal's crystalline form shimmered with a jagged, erratic crimson light, a physiological response to profound, primal terror among the Zareth. He stared at the holographic projection where the Draxian Armada had once hung. The telemetry readouts from Sector 44G were still cascading down the screens in chaotic waterfalls of red data. The fabric of space was still oscillating, bleeding exotic particles into the void like a wound that refused to clot. "Bluff," hissed the Kalan delegate, though his forehands were trembling violently as he gripped the edge of his anti-gravity pod. "It is a desperate, dying bluff. You do not have 50 of these reality-tearing abominations. The energy requirements alone, the infrastructure needed to build them. Your homeworld is a cinder, Ambassador Wright. You have no shipyards, you have no industrial base." Thomas Wright did not flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He stood in the center of the depression floor, a lone, frail man in a fraying suit, holding a galactic superpower hostage. "You underestimate the sheer paranoia of human defense contractors, Delegate," Thomas replied smoothly, reaching into his jacket pocket. The Council's automated security drones instantly hummed to life, their plasma emitters tracking his hand, but Othal waved them down with a frantic, trembling appendage. Thomas pulled out a solid-state data drive, a primitive, blocky thing encased in brushed steel, bearing the faded logo of Palantir Technologies. He tossed it onto the glass floor. It clattered loudly, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "Plug it in," Thomas ordered. "Or don't. It doesn't matter to me. But if you want to know how a dead species built 50 doomsday weapons in the dark, the data is right there." Hesitantly, a lower-tier maintenance drone scurried forward, absorbed the drive into its chassis, and interfaced with the Council's mainframe. Immediately, a massive secondary hologram projected above the assembly. It was a logistical map of the solar system, dated 3 years before the Draxian invasion. But it wasn't a map of cities or traditional orbital defense platforms. It was a map of black sites. "When we first made contact with your council," Thomas explained, pacing slowly around the glowing projection, "we realized very quickly that the galaxy was not the utopian federation you pretended it was. We saw the Kalan strip mining the outer rims. We saw the Draxian swarm consuming border worlds while you turned a blind eye. The United Nations Space Command knew an extermination-level event wasn't a possibility. It was an inevitability." The hologram zoomed in on the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, millions of rocks floating in the dark. "So, we didn't build our last line of defense on Earth," Thomas continued. "We contracted General Dynamics and SpaceX to hollow out 50 carbon silicate asteroids. Inside those rocks, entirely off the grid, automated foundries powered by geothermal friction built the Goliath-class carriers. They were constructed in absolute silence. No energy signatures, no supply chains for just cold, dead rocks floating in the void, birthing monsters in the dark." The projection shifted, showing the brutalist, blocky ships detaching from their asteroid cradles and slipping into the Oort cloud. disappearing from all known tracking algorithms. By the time the Draxians breached our outer defenses and glassed Earth, those 50 ships were already gone, Thomas said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper, scattered to the winds. Navigation systems wiped. They are running on total silence protocols. Othal leaned forward, his voice a grinding, desperate static. Ambassador. The Draxian Empire is vast. They possess hundreds of thousands of vessels across 3 sectors. Destroying one armada, even their vanguard, will not stop the swarm. They will trace the gravitational wake of your weapon. They will hunt your ghosts down. Let them. Thomas smiled a cold, humorless expression. Because the Goliath didn't just take out their fleet. Look at the coordinates of the spatial tier. The Council's chief technician manipulated the main projection. As the coordinates of Sector 44G were overlaid with the Galactic hyperlane map, a collective gasp echoed through the Grand Chamber. Sector 44G wasn't just empty space. It was the primary hyperlane nexus connecting the Draxian homeworld to their outer resource colonies. The gravitational shear from the Goliath's Gungnir drive hadn't just destroyed the ships. It had permanently fractured the subspace corridor. The hyperlane was severed. Millions of Draxian supply ships were now stranded, their faster-than-light capabilities rendered useless by the turbulent, impassable rip in reality. We didn't just break their sword, Thomas said softly. We cut off their oxygen. He turned back to the Grand Minister. Here are our terms. The Draxian Empire will immediately cease all hostile expansion. They will pull back to their inner systems. And this council will declare a 50 light-year exclusion zone around the Sol system. No one enters. No one scavenges our dead. If a single alien vessel crosses the Oort cloud, Thomas let the threat hang in the air, heavier than gravity. And if we refuse, the Kalan delegate spat, though the bravado was entirely hollow. If the Draxians refuse, Thomas looked up at the towering alien. The Goliath was targeting a military fleet, but those 49 other ships, they are programmed with the predictive algorithms of Palantir Space Command. They aren't looking for fleets. They are sitting in the dark, orbiting your homeworlds. Sirius Prime, Kalan Gart, the Zareth core worlds. If you do not enforce our terms, we won't fight a war. We will simply trigger the dead man switches. We will shatter the foundation of the Orion Spur, and we will drag all of you into the abyss with us. Thomas turned his back on the Galactic Council, straightening his jacket. You have 24 standard hours to issue the decree, he said, walking toward the grand doors, or the math takes over. Light years away, deep within the churning, radioactive nebula of the Perseus Arm, the UNS Oppenheimer sat in absolute, terrifying silence. To a passive sensor sweep, the ship didn't exist. It generated no heat, emitted no electromagnetic radiation, and produced no gravitational wake. It was a phantom, encased in layered, radar-absorbent metamaterials originally pioneered by Lockheed Martin back in the late 21st century. The interior of the ship was kept at a bone-chilling 4 degrees Celsius. The crew of 200 wore heavily insulated thermal suits, their breath pluming in the dim, red emergency lighting. Commander Samantha Cross floated weightless in the center of the bridge, anchoring herself to the tactical console with magnetic boots. She was 32, her hair cropped close to her scalp, her eyes hollowed out by months of sleep deprivation and the crushing weight of knowing she was a ghost of a murdered world. "Acoustic sensors only," she whispered, her breath visible in the freezing air. "Talk to me, Miller. What are we looking at?" Lieutenant Commander Jason Miller, wrapped in a thick parka bearing the faded patch of the defunct United States Space Force, pressed his ear against a bulky analog headset. In an era of quantum entanglement, communication, and instantaneous holographic data streams, the Oppenheimer had reverted to primitive, unhackable tech. "I'm picking up the ripple, Commander," Miller said, his voice trembling slightly. "Gravitational waves cascading through the nebula. It's faint, but the pattern is unmistakable. Massive, localized space-time shear." Cross closed her eyes, letting out a long, slow breath. "The Goliath." "Yes, ma'am." "Telemetry confirms a class. 5 anomaly in Sector 44G. The Draxian Vanguard fleet. It's gone. Wiped from the board. The hyperlane nexus is severed." A heavy silence fell over the freezing bridge. There was no cheering, no celebration. The destruction of the alien armada didn't bring Earth back. It just meant that Captain David Miller and the crew of the Goliath were dead. They had successfully tested the Gungnir drive in the field. The nightmare weapon actually worked. Godspeed, David, Cross whispered into the dark. Commander, spoke up Chief Engineer Bradley, his voice cracking over the localized, hardwired comms line. He was stationed 3 decks down, overseeing the monstrosity sitting in the ship's belly. If the Goliath detonated, the Council knows. The Draxians know. Which means the quiet phase of this operation is over. The swarm is going to start sweeping the nebulas with tachyon beams. This stealth plating won't hold up to an active, deep-spectrum scan. Cross opened her eyes. The grief vanished, replaced by the cold, calculating machinery of a soldier executing a final order. Let them scan, Cross said. We aren't hiding anymore. Bradley, spin up the IBM Quantum mainframes. Disengage the thermal dampeners. Let's make some noise. Ma'am? Miller looked up, confused. If we drop thermal stealth, we'll light up on their scopes like a supernova. We're sitting barely 3 parsecs from the Draxian inner perimeter. I know, Cross smiled grimly. That's exactly where we want to be. Executive Officer Davis, patch me into the ship-wide analog PA. A moment later, a sharp squeal of feedback echoed through the freezing corridors of the UNS Oppenheimer, followed by Cross's steady voice. Attention all hands. This is Commander Cross. We have just received confirmation. The Goliath has successfully deployed their payload. Sector 44G is locked down. The Draxian Vanguard is neutralized. Ambassador Wright has delivered our ultimatum to the Council. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over her crew. As of this moment, we are initiating Phase 2 of Operation Dead Hand. You all know the truth of this mission. The Council thinks there are 49 more Gungnir drives sitting in the dark. They think we have the power to shatter the galaxy 50 times over. Cross looked down at her console. The truth was the greatest, most terrifying secret humanity had ever kept. They don't know that DARPA and CERN only had enough stable dark matter to build 3 Gungnir drives, Cross continued, her voice echoing in the icy bridge. The Goliath had one. The Oppenheimer has one. The Vengeance has the last. The other 47 ships in our Ghost Fleet? They are empty threats. Rigged with conventional fusion warheads and Northrop Grumman spoofing suites to look like doomsday weapons on a sensor scan, it was the ultimate poker bluff. A civilization playing its final hand with nothing but mirrored sunglasses and a dead man's resolve. Our job, Cross said, is to make sure the Council never calls that bluff. We need to draw the Draxian Emperor's personal fleet out of their defensive perimeter. We need to make them think we are preparing to fire on their homeworld. We are the bait. On the tactical console, the ship's systems roared to life as Bradley disengaged the thermal dampeners. The temperature on the bridge immediately began to rise as the massive fusion reactors kicked in. Sensors are live, Miller reported, his hands flying across the physical keyboards. We are broadcasting our position in the clear. Unencrypted telemetry. We are practically screaming our coordinates to the Draxian capital. How long until they notice? Cross asked. 10 seconds. 5. Miller swallowed hard. Contact. Commander, I have massive tachyon spikes originating from the Draxian core world, Drax Prime. They see us. Oh my god, they see us. Put it on the main optical screen, Cross ordered. The reinforced steel shutters on the bridge peeled back, revealing the sprawling, violent colors of the nebula outside. But cutting through the cosmic dust was a fleet unlike anything human eyes had ever seen. It wasn't a swarm of 10,000 teardrops. It was a single, unimaginably massive dreadnought. It was the size of Earth's moon, a jagged, terrifying construct of black metal and violet energy, escorted by 300 elite Praetorian cruisers. This was the Hive Lord's personal armada, the absolute apex of Draxian military power. They had abandoned their homeworld's orbit to hunt down the single human ship that dared to light up on their doorstep. They're moving fast, Commander, Miller said, his voice tight. They're skipping across local space. They'll be in weapons range in 4 minutes. Let them come, Cross said, stepping up to the glass. Bradley, what's the status on the Gungnir containment field? Down in the engineering bay, Bradley watched the massive, lead-lined vault humming with a terrifying, destructive frequency. Boston Dynamics maintenance drones were frantically welding structural supports to the containment ring, their optical sensors flashing yellow with warning codes. "The field is stable, Commander," Bradley reported, wiping sweat from his brow as the temperature in the ship skyrocketed. "But ma'am, we aren't near a hyperlane nexus. If we detonate here, in the middle of a nebula, the spatial tear won't sever their supply lines. It'll just wipe out their fleet and take us with it." "I don't intend to sever a supply line, Bradley," Cross said. Her eyes locked on the approaching moon-sized dreadnought. "I intend to sever their homeworld." Miller looked at her, his eyes wide. "Commander, you're not targeting the fleet. Calculate the gravitational trajectory," Cross ordered, her voice cold as ice. "If we detonate the Gungnir drive right here and direct the spatial tear along the tachyon beam they are using to track us, where does the shockwave go?" Miller's fingers flew across the analog keypad. He ran the math. Then he ran it again. The blood drained from his face. "The tachyon beam is a direct entangled tether to Drax Prime," Miller whispered. "If we ignite the drive and use the beam as a conduit, the shockwave won't expand in a sphere. It'll travel down the tether like a localized tsunami. It'll bypass the fleet entirely." "And where will it hit?" Cross asked softly. "It will hit the core of Drax Prime," Miller breathed. "It will rip their planet inside out." The human Ghost Fleet didn't just have doomsday weapons. They had figured out how to aim them. "Commander!" Jenkins yelled from the comm station. "The Draxian dreadnought is hailing us. Audio only." "Put them through," Cross said. The grating, synthetic voice of the Draxian Hive Lord filled the bridge. It vibrated in their teeth, heavy with absolute malice. "Human vessel, you are a dying ember in the dark. Your trick with the spatial tear will not save you. We have adapted our shields to quantum fluctuations. Surrender your vessel, and we will grant your crew a swift biological termination." Cross leaned over the comms console. She thought of Earth. She thought of the blue skies she would never see again, the oceans that had boiled, the billions of souls crying out in the dark. "Hive Lord," Cross said, her voice dripping with venom. "I don't give a damn about your shields, because I'm not aiming at your ship." She looked at Miller and nodded. "Bradley," Cross ordered, "disengage magnetic locks. Fire Gungnir down the tether." Down in the bowels of the ship, Dr. William Carver's terrible mathematics came to life. The Boston Dynamics drones stepped back as the lead vault cracked open, revealing a core of absolute, devouring darkness. "See you in hell," Cross whispered. The UNS Oppenheimer didn't explode. It imploded. The universe screamed. Back in the Grand Diamond Chamber of the Galactic Council on Sirius Prime, the atmosphere had devolved from stunned silence into absolute, unrestrained panic. The holographic telemetry map in the center of the room was bleeding crimson. Grand Minister Othal clutched the edges of his podium, his crystalline exterior fracturing slightly under the physiological stress. The Council had just witnessed the telemetry of the UNS Oppenheimer, dropping its stealth in the Perseus arm. They had watched the Draxian Emperor's personal moon-sized dreadnought, the Apex Predator, warp into the system, and they had watched the human ship implode. "Fools!" the Kalan delegate gasped, his forearms waving in a mixture of relief and contempt. "The humans miscalculated. They detonated their weapon in open space." "The spatial tear is massive, yes, but it didn't hit the Draxian fleet. The dreadnought is outside the blast radius." Othal stared at the data streams, trying to slow his racing processors. The Kalan was right. The explosion of the Oppenheimer had created a massive gravitational sinkhole, but the Draxian dreadnought had stayed just outside the event horizon. The human commander had died for nothing. "Wait," whispered the Zerath chief technician, his voice trembling so violently the translation matrix struggled to render his words. "Look at the vector geometry, the shockwave. It isn't spherical. It's linear." The hologram shifted, tracking the catastrophic release of dark matter from the Oppenheimer's Gungnir drive. The explosion wasn't expanding outward in all directions. Instead, it was caught in a microscopic invisible tractor beam. "What is guiding it?" Othal demanded, his voice cracking. "The Draxian tachyon targeting beam, Minister," the technician cried out. The dreadnought was actively scanning the human ship with an entangled tachyon tether linked directly to the Draxian homeworld's super relay. The humans didn't miscalculate. They used the enemy's own sensor beam as a conduit. They injected the gravitational shear directly into the tether. On the massive holographic display, A terrifying red line traced from the Perseus arm, skipping across 3 sectors of space in less than a microsecond, bypassing the Draxian fleet entirely. It was heading straight for Drax Prime. Drax Prime was a planet entirely encased in a metallic shell, a staggering ecumenopolis teeming with 200 billion insectoid drones. It was the heavily fortified beating heart of the swarm, protected by orbital defense grids designed by the greatest engineers in the galaxy. But orbital defense grids are built to stop kinetic slugs and plasma beams. You cannot shoot down a localized gravitational tsunami traveling through an entangled quantum tether. The Council watched in petrified horror as the red line intersected with the planet's core. For one agonizing second, nothing happened. Then, the telemetry numbers for Drax Prime's planetary mass simply stopped making sense. The gravity of the planet didn't explode outward. It inverted. The planet's molten core was violently pulled outside of its titanium crust. Trillions of tons of metal, rock, and biological matter were spaghettified, stretched into microscopic, glowing threads of quantum dust. Through the sheer computing power of the Council's L3 Harris deep space sensory arrays, they could see the visual feed. The planet simply unraveled. Billions of towering spires, massive subterranean breeding pits, and orbital shipyards were sucked into a momentary pinpoint singularity that flashed with a blinding, terrifying white light, and then vanished. Where the capital of the greatest empire in the Orion Spur had stood, there was only a swirling, silent cloud of Cherenkov radiation. 200 billion souls, erased in a heartbeat. Aboard the apex predator in the Perseus arm, the Draxian Hive Lord sat on his obsidian throne. The entangled communication feeds from his homeworld didn't go dark with static. They just ceased to exist. His connection to the hive mind, the psychic tether that connected him to billions of his children, was violently severed, leaving a cavernous, screaming void in his mind. The Hive Lord collapsed, his exoskeleton cracking as he thrashed in absolute mind-shattering agony. The humans hadn't just destroyed his homeworld, they had lobotomized his species. Back in the council chamber, a low mechanical wailing began to echo. It was the emergency proximity alarms. Grand Minister Othal fell back into his throne, his glowing blue eyes dimming with sheer terror. They did it. By the ancestors. They actually did it. The Kalan delegate was hyperventilating, his previous arrogance entirely evaporated. Minister Othal, the tachyon relays. We are receiving new telemetry. Across the galaxy, they are waking up. The massive holographic map zoomed out, displaying the entire Orion Spur. One by one, red blips began to appear. They were stepping out of the shadows, dropping their Lockheed Martin stealth plating, disengaging their thermal dampeners. 5 ships materialized in the high orbit of Kalengard. 6 appeared above the Zarath core worlds. 10 uncloaked in the atmosphere of Sirius Prime, directly above the Galactic Council chamber itself. 48 massive, brutalist human carriers, all identical to the Goliath and the Oppenheimer. They were radiating massive, unstable, dark matter signatures. They are locking onto our planetary cores, the chief technician screamed. Minister, every major homeworld in the Council is targeted. The human ghost fleet is in position. Ambassador Thomas Wright walked down the grand concourse of Sirius Prime, his leather shoes clicking methodically against the synthetic diamond floors. Outside the massive vaulted archways of the corridor, the violet clouds of the gas giant were violently illuminated by the flashing, stroboscopic lights of planetary defense klaxons. The air, usually regulated to a perfectly tranquil 68 degrees and scented with synthesized jasmine, was thick with the acrid smell of ozone and the pheromones of terrified alien diplomats. Total chaos had descended upon the capital of the Orion Spur. Beings of 100 different species were fleeing toward the atmospheric evacuation pads. Crystalline Zarath bureaucrats were shattering their own appendages in their haste to board escaping transport shuttles. Kalan aristocrats were trampling over their own security details, desperate to get off-world before the human monstrosities hanging in their stratosphere decided to rip the planet inside out. Thomas kept his pace slow, measured, and entirely unbothered. He didn't look at the fleeing dignitaries. He just kept walking toward his own designated diplomatic shuttle, his hands resting casually in the pockets of his fraying suit. He was 50 yards from the landing bay when the Council's elite Praetorian guards swarmed him. There were 12 of them, towering figures of biological armor and plasma-charged weaponry. Just hours ago, these same guards had looked at him like he was a localized infection to be sterilized. Now, they didn't draw their weapons. They didn't even raise their voices. Instead, the terrifying 8-foot-tall soldiers dropped to their knees, their armored heads bowed so low they scraped the diamond floor. A hovering, gold-plated communications drone darted through the Praetorian ranks and projected the frantic, trembling holographic visage of Grand Minister Othal. "Ambassador Wright, please stop! I beg of you!" Othal's voice, normally a dignified grinding of crystalline static, was reduced to an undignified, desperate screech. "We surrender!" The Galactic Council, formally and unconditionally, surrenders. "Please, in the name of the ancestors, call off your fleet." Thomas stopped. He didn't smile. He turned his head slowly, his eyes cold, hollow, and utterly devoid of mercy. He looked at the projection of the most powerful being in the known galaxy, now reduced to a groveling, panicked mess. "I gave you 24 standard hours to issue the decree, Minister," Thomas said evenly, his voice barely rising above the wail of the planetary sirens. "You still have 23 hours and 40 minutes. Why are you bothering me early?" "Drax Prime is gone," Othal cried, the hologram glitching as the Grand Minister's biological chassis vibrated with sheer terror. "The Hive Lord's mind is completely shattered. The swarm is routed. Your ships, the 48 vessels you had hidden in the dark, they are holding station directly over our homeworlds. Their drives are spinning up. The planetary shielding is already failing just from the gravitational weight of their targeting matrices. If you detonate them, you will destroy the galactic infrastructure entirely. It will be a dark age that lasts 1,000,000 years. I am perfectly aware of the mathematics, Minister," Thomas lied smoothly. He didn't let a single micro-expression, not a twitch of his jaw nor a blink of his eyes, betray the fact that his heart was pounding so hard it threatened to fracture his ribs. What the Galactic Council didn't know, what the terrified alien leaders staring at the massive human warships in their skies couldn't possibly fathom, was that those ships were completely, fundamentally hollow. Deep in the subterranean bunkers of Earth, in the agonizing months before the Draxian orbital bombardment began, the United Nations Space Command had faced a brutal mathematical reality. DARPA Director William Ford and the lead engineers at Anduril Industries had realized they couldn't build 50 Gungnir drives. Humanity simply did not possess the resources. The CERN colliders had only managed to synthesize and stabilize enough refined exotic matter to build exactly 3 functional, reality-tearing weapons. The UNS Goliath had one. It was dead. The UNS Oppenheimer had one. It was dead. The UNS Vengeance held the last, currently sitting in total thermal stealth somewhere in the outer rims, the ultimate failsafe if the galaxy decided to call their bluff. But humanity didn't need 50 doomsday weapons. They only needed the illusion of 50 doomsday weapons. While they lacked dark matter, humanity had a massive surplus of Raytheon electronic warfare suites and Northrop Grumman spoofing technology. The 48 colossal ships currently terrifying the galaxy, the UNS Saratoga, the UNS Lexington, the UNS Enterprise, and 45 others were crewed by skeletons. They were entirely automated drone ships, rigged with massive, localized gravity wave projectors. They were broadcasting the exact, terrifying energy signature of a collapsing Alcubierre manifold, painting a sensor ghost so loud and aggressive it blinded the Council's tactical arrays. If a single Council ship, even a localized planetary defense platform, actually fired a standard plasma lance at one of those carriers, it would pop like a tin can, revealing nothing but empty corridors, automated flight computers, and a conventional fusion core. But humanity was betting the survival of their entire species on one simple, undeniable psychological fact. After watching 2 real Gungnir drives shatter the laws of reality, and erase the greatest military empire in history, absolutely no one in the galaxy would ever dare to pull the trigger to find out if the remaining 48 were real. It was the ultimate cosmic game of Russian roulette, and humanity had just convinced the entire universe that every single chamber was loaded with a hollow-point bullet aimed straight at their heads. "Call them off, Ambassador," Othal pleaded, his holographic eyes darting upward as if trying to look through the ceiling to the massive human dreadnought hovering in the stratosphere. "Name your terms. We will grant anything. Wealth, technology, territory. Just stop the sequence." Thomas adjusted his fraying collar. He let the silence stretch, letting the Grand Minister stew in his own absolute powerlessness. "We do not want your wealth, Minister. We do not want your territory," Thomas finally spoke, his voice ringing with the absolute authority of a man who held the stars hostage. "The terms remain exactly as I stated on the assembly floor. You will codify the Sol Exclusion Act." Thomas stepped closer to the drone, his shadow falling over the golden chassis. "The terms of quarantine. The Sol Exclusion Zone. The Sol system, and a precise 50 light-year spherical radius surrounding it, is now sovereign, restricted human territory. Absolute prohibition. No Galactic Council ship, no Draxian scavenger, no corporate mining vessel, and no alien craft of any kind will enter that space. The dead man's trigger. If a single alien sensor ping, stray tachyon beam, or physical vessel crosses the Oort cloud of our system, the human ghost fleet stationed above your worlds will immediately drop their magnetic locks and trigger the dead man's switches." "We will not fight a conventional war," Thomas whispered harshly. "We will just pull the pin." "Agreed! I swear it by the core. It is agreed!" Othal shouted instantly, weeping openly now. "The decree is being broadcast on all HyperNet channels right now. We are encoding the quarantine protocols into the navigational computers of every registered ship in the Orion Spur. The Draxian remnants are already fleeing back to their outer colonies. They are broken, Ambassador. You broke them!" "We are also requiring reparations," Thomas added coldly, not missing a beat. "Earth is a cinder. You let the swarm burn our oceans. You will fix it." "How? How can we fix a glassed world?" "You will deploy your Genesis units," Thomas commanded, referencing the highly classified, automated terraforming fleets used by the Council to prepare pristine resort worlds. Automated drones only. They will push atmospheric scrubbers, biological seed vaults, and oceanic purifiers to the edge of the exclusion zone. Our automated tugs will bring them in. You will provide the tools to rebuild what you allowed to be destroyed. And you will do it in absolute silence. No communication channels, no monitoring software. If we detect a single line of spyware in those Genesis units, the Kalen homeworld cracks. Yes, yes, of course. The Genesis fleet will be deployed within the hour, Othal stammered. "Just give the abort code. I am begging you, Ambassador Wright. Please." Thomas reached into the pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a small, heavy analog satellite phone. It was an archaic piece of technology, heavily modified by Boeing engineers to bypass standard frequencies and bounce an encrypted, localized signal directly off the Council's own hyper relays. He flipped open the plastic cover. He looked at the Grand Minister one last time. Then, he pressed the single red button. Across the galaxy, the 48 human ghost ships simultaneously executed their programmed sequence. They abruptly powered down their spoofing engines. The massive, terrifying dark matter signatures that had been screaming on the Council's planetary scanners slowly, agonizingly faded back down to a quiet baseline. The ships didn't leave orbit. They didn't retreat into the hyperlanes. They simply went dark. Their Lockheed Martin radar-absorbent metamaterials engaged, and they slipped back into absolute thermal stealth. To the naked eye, and to the most advanced sensors in the galaxy, they simply vanished. But the Council knew they were still there, invisible phantoms, holding silent, eternal vigil over the alien capitals. The sword of Damocles remained hanging, unseen, but ever present. Thomas put the phone back in his pocket and snapped it shut. The sound was deafening in the suddenly quiet corridor. "The countdown is paused, Minister," Thomas said, turning his back on the hologram and walking toward the bay doors. "But the fleet remains. They will always remain. If you ever look toward Earth again, remember what we did in the dark." Thomas Wright boarded his shuttle alone. He was the last human to ever walk the halls of the Galactic Council, leaving behind a legacy of pure, unadulterated terror. In the decades that followed, the political and physical landscape of the galaxy fundamentally changed. The once arrogant empires walked on eggshells. The Draxian swarm, fractured and entirely lobotomized by the loss of their hive lord, devolved into a pathetic state of primitive infighting, retreating entirely from the galactic stage. The Galactic Council hastily passed strict draconian laws against planetary bombardment and aggressive expansion, terrified that another seemingly primitive species might figure out how to weaponize the fundamental geometry of spacetime. And at the absolute edge of the Orion Spur, behind a terrifying 50 light year wall of dead, silent space, Earth began to heal. Massive automated alien drones dropped thousands of atmospheric scrubbers and bioengineered seed vaults onto the edge of the Sol system, fleeing immediately after dropping their cargo, utterly terrified of the invisible crosshairs they felt trained on their hulls. Human automated tugs dragged the technology back to the homeworld. Slowly, the boiled oceans cooled and refilled with synthetic rain. The ash-choked skies cleared, their toxic gray giving way to a pale, hopeful blue, revealing a sun that shone on a scarred but recovering world. Deep within the reinforced subterranean bunkers of Mars and the hollowed-out spinning carbon silicate asteroids of the main belt, the few million human survivors began to tentatively emerge. They stepped out onto the red dirt of Mars and looked up at the stars, knowing that they were entirely isolated, locked in a quarantine of their own making. They were cut off from the rest of the universe, surrounded by aliens who viewed them as apocalyptic monsters. But as they breathed in the filtered air and watched the distant, blinking lights of their own automated defense grids, they also knew they were safe. Because out there, scattered in the cold, unforgiving dark of the galactic void, the ghosts of the UNS Goliath and the UNS Oppenheimer stood eternal watch. Humanity hadn't just survived the absolute end of the world. They had looked into the abyss, smiled, and made the universe blink first. And that is the story of how humanity turned certain extinction into the greatest bluff in galactic history. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark corners of sci-fi and HFY, smash that like button. It really helps the channel out. Share this video with your fellow sci-fi lovers to spread the legend of the human ghost fleet. And make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another epic tale from the stars. What would you have done if you were in Commander Cross's shoes? Let me know in the comments below.
Hi, my name is Tran Trung, the owner and manager of Palace Truths. After watching the video, the Galactic Council mocked humanity's last ship, then it erased an entire alien armada, HFY, I'd really like to know what you think. How did this story make you feel? For me, this story was less about revenge and more about resilience. Even when everything seemed lost, the characters reminded us that courage, teamwork, and determination can change the course of a seemingly impossible situation. That feeling stayed with me long after the final scene. What moment stood out to you the most, and which character earned your respect the most? If you had been faced with the same impossible odds, would you have chosen the same path or tried something different? In our own lives, we may never face battles like these, but we all have moments where staying calm and refusing to give up matters. If this story gave you something to think about or simply entertained you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy HFY stories like this, feel free to like the video or subscribe only if you'd like to join us for more adventures.